So now there's a new Blender out, 2.93, and we haven't yet began to jump to it because we've been spending all of our time configuring 2.83.12. But the thing is you want to use the latest version of Blender, but you don't want to move your configuration and have to reconfigure everything all over again and be dealing with exponentially more folders for each version of Blender. And while the method I'm about to discuss isn't the most recommended method, it is my method, which is what I aim to discuss in this video. So first things first, we've configured 2.83, but we did not configure 2.93. If we pop it open, there's no add-ons in it. There's nothing. It's blank, it's bare, it's naked. So let's just close that. We don't want it. Let's just delete the 2.83 folder. And the thing that I'm using for this is called link shell extension, which allows you to create symbolic links of folders. So what I'm going to do is right click 2.83, and we're just going to choose pick link source, and then we're just going to drop as a symbolic link. And so basically now there's a symbolic link of a folder that is pointing to the previous folder, and we're going to just change the name to be 2.93. So now when Blender opens, it's not going to even know that this is a fake folder. It's just going to open and pop up exactly like the other Blender did. And so now we're able to get to work. In fact, we haven't even made it where it starts up in Box Cutter and made that our default setup, because that is definitely my default setup, Box Cutter on blast. So let's just Control Q, quit this, and let's just launch it again. And now we see that, once the splash screen's out the way, we are ready to rumble with Box Cutter. And that's really all there is to it when it comes to migrating your installation across Blenders. So there's another version of Blender. There's 2.92, which is probably going to be the next stable. So this one I've also been spending some time in. I like to spend my time in all the different versions of Blender, just ensuring that everything's completely stable. And we see that this one has no configuration. So I'm just going to close that because I have no time for such things. I'm going to right click the 2.83 folder, pick the link source, and we are just going to drop as a symbolic link. And so now that we have this, we can change this to 2.92, and we're able to continue on with our installation setup. So now everything that we do for one Blender happens for all of them across multiple versions. So we now have 2.92 coming up, ready to rumble inside of Box Cutter. And of course, if there's some change in the preferences or the way that they're remembered across versions, it's definitely going to cause an issue with this. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, this isn't the most recommended method, but it is definitely my method for managing all these versions of Blender. So I don't even deal with them on a individual level anymore. I deal with them just with one folder as the root, and then it just continues propagating. In fact, I can right click this, pick link source, paste a symbolic link, and we'll just name this one 2.94 because it's coming up in the future. And that's how Proxy likes to work. He has his links just named up all the way to the future that we may never see, but it's just set up. And now we have all these versions of Blender configured. We can go to the experimental builds where I've been checking out some of the sculpt dev stuff and also playing with geometry nodes before time. But really when it comes to experimental, I was obsessed with new booleans. So even when I pop those open, we see that this one was built for Blender 2.91, which isn't actually in this list. So if we pop it open, it's going to show us a newborn baby. In fact, we didn't even get to see it, but here's our splash screen. If it shows the select with and a spacebar option along with theme, that's not going to work. So we want to also have one for 2.91. So I'm just right clicking, picking my link source, and we're dropping it as a symbolic link. Like I said, there are some restrictions that may apply if they change the formatting of preferences across Blender in the future. But for the most part, it's been pretty straightforward and we haven't run into issues with it yet. But this is just how we deal with newer versions of Blender internally. So now I can actually go to the new Boolean branch where Howard was working on the new Booleans, which have changed the way I approach some aspects of modeling. And we can now go under behavior, change our Boolean solver to exact, press F4, bring up our preferences. And I'm not saying you should work this way, but I'm saying it is allowed now as a result of recent updates. But we can now set this to 0 and cut, completely fitting on the surface. But there are some things that are still up in the air with it that I feel need to be addressed. But for the most part, it does support using exact. However, the offsetting is something that is still a bit of a struggle, and eventually someday we aim to be able to perfectly extend shapes without you having to deal with any sort of offset issues. In fact, with this one, we see that it extended it off into the future without any offset issues. So it still is something that we're addressing, but just letting you know that when you have your Blender configured across multiple versions like this, that it also unlocks additional things within the add-ons for you to be able to do, because we're always looking towards the future when it comes to our tools, but we also want to make sure that we're working with the last official version.